Transcendental Ontology, and I will present something out of this book. It just came out. So originally I had a different title, but now because I had to split up my lectures, I will be giving one of the lectures I'm giving here on descent and object. Let me just briefly sketch some of the ideas I would have presented, which of course relate to what Maurice has just introduced. So I was about to say, but then this will derive in a certain sense from what I present here about descent and object, which can simply be called inverse Habermas. So you just get Habermas backside, as it were. So yeah, I wanted to say that of course we need to distinguish in social ontology between mind dependence and being a product of the mind. It's just not the same. So I would have said that social facts are what I call attitude dependent meta facts, which necessarily involve some facts which are not attitude dependent. So social facts are attitude dependent meta facts such that the inferential network which belongs to meta, so meta facts are facts about facts, and facts are what is true about things, and social facts are facts such that they organize facts, so they are facts clusters, and those facts clusters exist only due to attitudes, but they are not thereby produced by the attitudes. They are not spontaneously created by a particular attitude. Just because I changed my attitude about a 10-euro bill does not make it a 20-euro bill. Okay, and why is this the case? Because attitude-dependent metafacts by necessity involve some first-order facts which are not constructed by the metafacts. But yeah, I won't go into this. Instead, I will present the outlines of a kind of realism about sense, a realism which I derive from Frege's notion of sense. But I will the accent, the emphasis will be put on Frege's notion of sense. So the tradition which which comes out of Frege tended to emphasize when talking about objectivity, like since Dammit and so forth, tended to emphasize on Fregean meaning rather than on Fregean sense, because many people in particular Klein thought that sense was obscure and that maybe there was no such thing, but whatever, we were left with Fregean meaning. And now I will just give you another kind of Frege, as you will see, where it's all about the realism of sense, or what I call the ficticity of sense. The paper is way too long, so I will just sketch some of the arguments in between, but I hope you'll get the overall picture. According to the tradition of modern Cartesian epistemology, and that's of course the proton pseudos, an object, or as Michael Williams has said last week in Bonn, the worst thing anyone has ever done was when Descartes sat down and started to meditate. An object or a thing is ultimately nothing but the reference point of a fallible act of reference. An object, according to this tradition, is that which can be missed precisely because it is defined as a reference target of a particular, albeit conceptually mediated, instance of objective purport. This chimes with the truth of the realistic platitude that there are at least some objects which exist independently of being referred to, a platitude Adrian W. Moore recently referred to as the basic assumption. The so-called external world thereby comes to be understood in one way or other as the sum total of all such thing objects, or just as, I quote, the sum total of the spatial, as Frege has it. I never understood why he leaves all time there. There's just one passage where Frege defines the external world, and he says it's the sum total of the spatial. In any event, it is the objective ontic correlate to all our successful, that is true representations, and thus, of course, a set which is smaller than the set of all possible intentional correlates, given that they are false thoughts. Given that they are false thoughts, the set of all correlates of true thoughts is smaller, even of possible true thoughts is smaller than the sets of possible intentional correlates. Against this background, which is why Descartes had to explain how the will can be an excess over true thought. Against this background, one straightforwardly arrives at the identification of the external world with an absolute conception of reality. Reality, thusly understood, is the set of what is there anyway, to quote Bernard Williams's and Adrian Moore's phrase again, on which I elaborated yesterday. As Bernard Williams has argued in his book, Descartes, the Project of Pure Inquiry, this absolute conception of reality results from a certain conception of representations. This conception of representations, which itself springs from a certain conception of objecthood, which, as I will argue today, is essentially incoherent, sets out from Descartes' reminder of fallibility. Our finite reference to objects is fallible. As Descartes puts it, there is a potential gap between the objective reality of representations, that is, between the fact that they even have so much as a determinate intentional content, and their formal reality, which would be the fact that there is a fact of the matter represented in the form of the objective reality of our representations. For Descartes, a formal reality is a really existing object where really existence should be glossed as independent from its relation to reference. What really exists is therefore non-intentional. According to this apparently innocuous conception of objecthood, we can easily understand the difference between, say, a tree and the representation of a tree. It is possible to fell or to climb a tree, etc., which are not applicable to representations of trees. The potential divergence between the way the external world is in a particular case and the way we represent it in each case is the metaphysical starting point of modern, but in a sense also already of ancient epistemology. And this is, if you set up the story this way, as the Cartesian tradition does, you can easily see why things go wrong with social objects or social facts, because social facts are, according to this tradition, reference dependent, because you cannot individuate them without mentioning reference in their individuation, but this does not entail that they are produced in the sense of the representation of a tree. I can just produce the representation of a tree without thereby changing the nature of trees. And then they thought, well, given that money would involve something like reference dependence, I can just change the nature of money by thinking differently about money. So this tradition obviously runs from Descartes to Marx. Thus, the first step, and as will become clear in due course, also the proton pseudos of traditional epistemology, is a particular and in no way necessary conception of our fallibility, according to which fallibility consists in the fact that we refer to objects or facts which exist or obtain within an external world, ontically independent of our reference to it. The logical form of reference, or rather intentionality, is thereby distinguished from the formal reality of objects. However, this metaphysically enriches the purely formal theory of objects, which has it, and I'm committed to this theory, which has it that object or thing is defined as the reference target of a truth apt and therefore fallible thought. Suddenly, objects as reference targets are identified with objects in the external world, a move not covered by the purely formal theory of objects, which I accept without accepting the concept of an external world in the traditional sense of the term. The traditional conception of fallibility is associated with an ontology which hypostatizes its condition of fallibility, namely the ontological difference between reference and object, to an external world on the one hand, and what is even worse, according to most commentators and hearers of this tradition, to thinking substance on the other hand. That is, the ontological difference of reference and object turns into the somehow thoroughly determined totality of everything, which is the case independently of being referred to on one side, and the totality of acts of reference on the other side of a conceptually dividing line. Unfortunately, the concept of an external world is usually not specified beyond the seemingly intuitive conception of a sum total of what is there anyway. For this reason, the so-called problem of the external world remains completely underdetermined, because its crucial notion, that of an external world, is not only unclear, but provably is the result of a mistaken reification of a conceptual facet of our fallible reference to objects. So if you think about fallibility in a different way, you thereby think about the external world in a different way. So which is why I think that we should repair the not only fallible but false conception of fallibility, which has been the opening move of modern epistemology. So, in what follows, I will first, but I probably won't have the time to go through this, show that the problem of the external world leads to a more radical and more revealing problem of the internal world. In this context, I will draw consequences from Heidegger's correct observation that the actual crux is the problem of the world, which I spelled out yesterday. As a remedy, I recommend a fundamental ontological turning in epistemology, beginning with the reminder that intentionality itself exists and therefore belongs to the world, or rather, as we can already say, that it belongs to a plurality of fields of sense. Or, quite simply, qua object of a higher order reference, reference is itself something which can be missed. reference is itself a reference target. So given that I can think about reference is a reference target, and whatever I can think of, also I will argue, whatever I can think of with a truth at thought can be missed. This is also where Descartes starts, right? So if I can have a thought with something like a determinate truth value, then the thought is of something which can be missed. But then he misconstrues this fallibility because he thinks of fallibility. This will be the overall argument of the first part of the paper, because he thinks of fallibility and the tradition in terms of a relation between truth at thoughts, whatever they are in detail, and what is there anyway. And what is there anyway is then identified with what can be individuated without any reference to reference. And that's of course a mistake, because reference is among the things which are there anyway. So, external world, internal world, world. The problem of the external world is a consequence of a metaphysics of intentionality, which can be reconstructed as an answer to the question how fallibility and therefore objective knowledge is possible. The question as to the possibility of knowledge and the associated confrontation with Cartesian skepticism results from a particular theory of fallibility. Modern Cartesian metaphysics of intentionality explains fallibility with recourse to the ultimately ontological difference between truth at thought and what they are about. Whenever we intend to refer to an object, we insert it as a conceptually determined object into the horizon of our awareness. That's at least a minimal condition, psychological condition for objective knowledge. We evidently intend to refer to this rather than that, and thus to something at least minimally distinct. The objective purport of our epistemic reference is realized in our judging that something is such and so, for example, that x is f, or taking over from Frege, f on x. Hence, objective purport can only be established under the condition that a margin, or as I say in German, a Spielraum of contingency is thrown open, in particular, the margin of the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong. So I don't think there's any such thing as a monovalent truth predicate which is operative on a basic level of perception, which would then give rise to a variety of the myth of the given. So as soon as you have an object in view, you have it in view such that you could have something else in view which guarantees that you're fallible. The objectivity of our objective purport consists in the fact that we refer to something as a such and so, and at the same time such that the object thusly inserted into our horizon could be otherwise than it appears. For this reason, there's always a double contingency and fallibility at play in objective knowledge, which, as I will argue, does not ruin a realistic truth predicate in suitable discourses. To take an example, in judging that a car is passing by, we are both fallible in judging that a car rather than a hologram is passing by, and in judging that we believe that a car is passing by because we see it rather than because we hallucinate it. Those are two very different forms of fallibility. We are, in a word, fallible with respect to the content of experience and with respect to its respective logical form. Truth at thought is therefore constitutively fallible. Whatever we determine as being thus and so, for example as being f, is f in contradistinction to any relative component, which is ruled out at least implicitly and in some judgments, of course, also explicitly. What is f could also be j or h, that is, everything to which we can intend to refer is at least epistemically contingent. Even if any x were necessarily f, the assertion that it is f indicates that it could be false. To assert is to present as true and therefore to make a knowledge claim. As claims, knowledge claims are defeasible and revisable. This constitutive revocability of knowledge claims, of course not of knowledge, manifests itself on the level of an ontology of predication in that everything which can be f could also be g, h, or something else. Now, the Cartesian tradition in epistemology locates this contingency in the wrong position, namely in the existence of truth at thought and not in its logical form. That there is truth at thought is, according to this tradition, contingent regarding the reference target. In this way, the ontological can be distinguished from the epistemological order. World and mind are separated along this axis of contingency. Yet, the ontological order has to be such that fallible thought can occur within it. This means that the external world has to encompass the inner world of truth at thought if we are to account for the contingent existence of fallibility. It is impossible to differentiate external and internal world on the traditional model, for Descartes' determination of the external as res extensa overlooks that it is not the case that we are fallible because we refer to objects in the external world, but because all truth at thought is fallible regarding its reference target, including truth at thought about truth at thought. Any answer to the question, what is reference, can be false, and is thus most certainly neither indifferent regarding its truth value, nor and even less true in a monovalent sense. So philosophy is just as fallible as every other instance of objective purport, otherwise we wouldn't be saying anything. Even so, if I'm talking about reference, there must be a sense in which I'm fallible. But evidently, and there you can see why the Cartesian conception of fallibility goes wrong, identifying objecthood with being part of the set of everything which exists in the external world, is that when I refer to reference, then reference, according to this tradition, is evidently not part of the external world, because the external world is defined as that which does not contain things such that those things can only be individuated by mentioning reference. Therefore, reference to reference cannot be fallible according to this tradition, which is why the cogito is infallible and incorrigible and so forth. Okay? That's why he needs the cogito. So it's not that he discovers the cogito, he needs the cogito in order to make sure that reference to reference is infallible, for otherwise this theory of fallibility breaks down. Which is why I suggest to make a move at this point, to make a move from a Cartesian to a Kantian theory of intentionality and fallibility. And the Kantian, this is roughly what McDowell does, even though with different intentions. And this move consists in the reminder that intentionality as such is fallible. So there's something constitutively fallible about our objective purport, which does not in no way entail skepticism. It's just, because fallibility does not entail, of course, that we are false about everything or even possibly wrong about everything, which is why Descartes needs dreaming argument and genius malignus and so forth. So there is a way of switching from a Cartesian to a Kantian theory of fallibility, but what happens in Kant is that he triggers a problem of the internal world. Because once you make this move, okay, you might as well miss entities in the internal world, and that's Kant's problem. The associated, as Jim Conant has shown in recent publications, the associated worries of Kantian skepticism are even worse than the problems of Cartesian skepticism, because according to the tradition of Kantian skepticism, which runs from Kant to Kripkenstein, you might even miss mindedness as such, as James Conant puts it. You might even be wrong in your relation to mental states. So what do you do about this? This is the big question, and this only becomes a problem for Kant, the Kantian theory of intentionality, because Kant has a subjective notion of sense. For Kant of course does not distinguish between any such thing as Phrygian Sinn und Bedeutung. He always mentions them together and defines them as relation to the object. Beziehung aufs Objekt, that's his definition of very vague definition of reference, but then any object for Kant which is a suitable reference target is an appearance, which is why for Kant the self is an appearance, because if we define appearance as that which can be referred to by the truth at thought, which is constitutively fallible, then the self itself becomes a fallible reference to itself. Okay. Yet, contrary to Kant, I think we need to hold that true thoughts do not apprehend appearances, but grasp things in themselves. In this context, the distinction between states of affairs, or rather facts and things, doesn't matter. For a fact can be just as much an object of thought as a more common object such as a chair. Even though a fact might be something about a chair, and thus serves a very different function in the economy of true thought, we can still refer to it with a truth at thought. For this reason, facts satisfy the minimal requirement for objecthood according to the purely formal theory of objects here defended. A true thought grasps a thing or fact in itself. There is thus no gap to be bridged in true thought, whereas false thought actually stops short of the facts or things. Okay, so I would add, even though McDowell also does it recently, that true thought does not stop short of the facts, whereas false thought does. So I would reserve the notion of appearance to false thoughts and would think of true thoughts as of facts themselves. A true thought is a fact. And that's I think, a good old Friggian point. So let us call an appearance the object or content of truth act thought. Appearances are thus divided into true and mere appearances, an option McDowell has famously labeled disjunctivism. Disjunctivism rules out the hybrid category of true mere appearances. There are no true mere appearances, so there are either true thoughts or appearances, but there are no true mere appearances. A true appearance is not a representation, and as such it doesn't have any specifically mentally distorted side, whereas a mere appearance is only a mental phenomenon which might still be a fact, given that mere appearances exist among other things. Of course, some true appearances are mind-dependent, such as all truths about mind. So, truths about mind are trivially mind-dependent, even though mind is not produced by itself. So the distinction between true appearance and mere appearance is just the distinction between truth and falsity in their possible relation to truth and thought, and not the distinction between states of the external and episodes in the internal world. Kant is evidently not always clear about his use of the thing in itself appearance distinction, for he sometimes identifies appearances with representations which I regard as simply false. In line with the criticism in my book At the Limits of Epistemology, it is important to notice too that I don't agree with McDowell's assessment of the impact of disjunctivism. Disjunctivism is not an effective anti-skeptical tool, it only proves that there's nothing inherent in the idea of a true thought or in the conditions for true thought which would make objective knowledge as such impossible. Yet it does not show that there are any true thoughts, but only that there could be. So in order to save time, let me just summarize what I would have done and how this would have led me to the notion of social facts. So I think that we can simply distinguish between two conditionals. The one I call the basic ontological conditional, I introduced these terms yesterday, and the other can be called the epistemological conditional. The ontological conditional says if there's anything at all, then such and such has to be the case. So at this point it doesn't matter what you write into, what you put into the consequent, but evidently, given that the conditional itself exists, okay, it satisfies its own antecedent, therefore we can conclude from the ontological conditional that there's something rather than nothing. For example, the ontological conditional. This is not the case with the epistemological conditional, which says that if the conditions of possibility of knowledge are satisfied, then we can know something. So you start by spelling out the condition of possibility, but you will never actualize the antecedent in epistemology. So epistemology at the best can prove that knowledge is possible, which even happens in McDowell, but can never prove that knowledge is actual. Whereas the ontological conditional immediately entails that something is actual, namely the ontological conditional. So from this I would conclude that there must be something about ontology which makes our access to what there is more immediate than our access to what we think about thought. So being is closer to thought than thought. And this is revealed in the transition from the problem of the external world to the problem of the internal world to the problem of the world which I haven't mentioned today, but which I will spell out tonight and which I haven't mentioned yesterday. So being is even closer to thought than thought itself, because we might be wrong about many things, but even false thoughts exist. So there's an overall primacy of existence over thought. So let me just stop here, and yeah, so that we still have time for discussion.
Okay.